Welcome to the Economy Magazine at I-24 News, where we provide a daily view on the world markets and the global economy. I'm Natalie Ehrlich. Well, coming up today, Brazil sees its largest economic contraction in 25 years. In addition to the 3.7% fall in growth, South America's largest economy also suffers the worst inflation, soaring to 10.72% in 2015. Well, Sam Chester of Clarity Capital gives us the breakdown and tells us what's next for Brazil. An Iranian President, Hassan Rouhani, travels to Europe, the country's first official visit to the continent in 2 decades. Tehran is back in business, and the world wants a piece of Iran's consumer pie. Deals said to total in the double-digit billions. Another mixed day for markets in Asia. This follows Wall Street's 1% drop on Wednesday after the U.S. Fed signaled concerns on the world economic outlook. Well, on Thursday, mainland China shares extended heavy losses. The Shanghai closing down 2.9%. Hong Kong's Hang Seng also trimmed gains, finishing the day flat. And Japan's Nikkei fell 0.71%. In Europe, the session over there was choppy. By the afternoon trading, though, London's FTSE was down 0.48%. Germany's DAX was down 1.57%. And the French CAC down 1.12%. U.S. markets were positioned for a higher open. Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Greek Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras signed bilateral agreements on Wednesday before holding a government-to-government meeting. Well, one of the main issues, energy cooperation between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. Large natural gas reserves were discovered in the eastern Mediterranean recently, and now the possibility of building a subsea network of pipelines or electricity cables is also on the table. Netanyahu is set to visit Cyprus on Thursday for a trilateral meeting with Greek and Cypriot leaders.
And in this G2G meeting, we'll take further steps to strengthen this partnership in diplomacy and defense, in cybersecurity, counterterrorism, in economics, trade, energy, and innovation. Energy also includes not merely discussing the possibilities of using our offshore gas, but also connecting Israel, Cyprus, and Greece with an electricity cable.
Britain signed a back tax deal with Google in which the tech giant will pay £130 million, which is some $185 million, to settle claims covering a 10-year period. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, and Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn, exchanged heated words in Parliament on Wednesday. Corbyn accused Cameron of capitulating in negotiations at the expense of the British taxpayer. Cameron responded by attacking the previous Labour government's record on pursuing Google for taxes.
Independent experts have suggested that Google is paying an effective tax rate on its UK profits of around 3%. Does the Prime Minister dispute that figure?
If, like me, he's genuinely angry about what happened to Google under Labour, can I tell him a few people he could call? Maybe he should start by calling Tony Blair. You can get him at JP Morgan. Call Gordon Brown. Apparently you can get him at a Californian bond dealer called PIMCO. He could call Alistair Darling. I think he's at Morgan Stanley, but it's hard to keep up. Those are the people to blame for Google not paying their taxes. We're the ones who got them to pay.
Japan's economy minister, Akira Amari, resigned on Thursday, now taking responsibility for a political funding scandal which has rocked the government. During a televised news conference, Amari acknowledged taking money from a construction company executive, but said that he had told his aides to correctly record them as a political donation. Amari is a close ally of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and a core member of his policy team. He played a leading role in Abe's economic policies and led Japan's negotiations for the TPP trade bloc.
In order to beat deflation and create a strong economy, we need to pass the budget and necessary legislation through Parliament as soon as possible. Anything that hampers this must be eliminated, and I am no exception.
And now we're joined on Skype for a view on Brazil's economy. We have Sam Chester of Clarity Capital. Thank you as ever for being with us, Sam.
It's a pleasure.
Well, look, for years, Brazil was lauded for its economic engine, but now with sinking commodity prices, we're also seeing softness in Brazil. Just how bad is the economic situation over there?
Well, I can tell you the environment the last few days in Rio de Janeiro, where I've been, I would say anxiety mixed with a dynamicism, which is really unique to Brazil and perhaps other economies in Latin America. Let's remember in the last few years, Brazil has led the Latin economies doing incredibly well. But as you said, the GDP last year dropped by almost 4%. In 2016 and 2017, IMF is expecting similar cuts in the economic growth rate here. Unemployment, a major problem, over 10%. Inflation, a major problem, over 10%. Investor flight is growing as well. Low global demand for commodities driven by the Chinese slowdown is not going to help matters. And then, of course, you have major political corruption issues. The largest gas company in Brazil is also facing major corruption issues. And the debt, the government's debt, is over 60% of its budget, of the GDP. These issues are not going to go away in the next year. They're not going to go away in the year after that. And therefore, Brazil is really going to not only be facing economic difficulties of its own, but is also going to be causing problems for all of Latin economies.
Right. As you mentioned, there are significant pressures now affecting that economy. Are there any positives that you can see?
So there's actually one sector, which is a major sector in Brazil, which has done very well in the last quarter and much of 2015, and that's agriculture. I mean, Brazil is the leading agriculture basin for much of Latin America, imports throughout North America and Europe as well. And although agriculture traditionally is seen as more of a past generation industry, an industry which is not receptive to the sort of disruptions that investors generally look for, there actually are areas. One example you could point to is in the commercial drone space, where Brazil companies are actually leading global demand for new technologies to really disrupt and bring new opportunities into the agricultural space. So Brazil, agriculturally, again, not an industry that people often get too excited about, but that is one area which is continuing to show growth into 2016.
Well, thanks as ever for your insight, Sam. Very much appreciate it, all the way from Brazil. Now moving on from Brazil to the Brexit. Britain will vote in a referendum whether to stay or leave the Eurozone. But in the meantime, this debate is getting tense.
Across Europe, on the continent and the Isles, the possibility of a British exit from the European Union is at the top of the agenda. The Conservative-led British government has been calling for reforms to the EU partnership, including limits on workers and migrant rights, and keeping economic competitiveness open, as opposed to the EU's stated goal of an ever closer union. But British Prime Minister David Cameron thinks that there may be a common way forward.
I think we should be focusing on the positive opportunity for Britain. Imagine the scale of the prize if we can remain a member of the single market with 500 million consumers, a quarter of the global economy, with a seat at the table and a say over the rules, and making sure we do right by our business for jobs and investment and growth in the UK, combined with action to make sure we deal with the things that frustrate people about the EU.
With the possibility for a British referendum on the issue set for some time in the next 24 months, the campaigns are coming out. A group of right-wing political players are hoping to rile up support for closing borders using fear of the growing population of asylum seekers from the Middle East. Meanwhile, British unions representing around 6 million workers are poised to join the anti-Brexit camp. The EU's robust labour protections have been an important ingredient in their support.
The TUC's assessment is that if Britain was to leave the EU, there would be a really big risk to rights that matter to people's real lives, from paid holidays to parental leave, health and safety at work. These are the sorts of rights that people depend on week by week.
On the trade front, a Brexit could be problematic. The Northern Ireland-Irish Republic border is Britain's only land contact with the EU, and this week the Irish Prime Minister suggested that a move away from the EU could put a hamper on trade. And separations could multiply. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair suggested that Scotland could find itself with a new opportunity to declare independence if a separation moves forward.
There is also a dimension that goes a little unnoticed, which is that, in my opinion, if Great Britain and the United Kingdom vote to leave Europe, Scotland will vote to leave the United Kingdom.
With polls suggesting that Britons are torn evenly down the middle on whether to exit the 28-nation union, the possibility is there, and the drive forward on both sides has just begun.
Joining us on set now for insight on the opening of Iran's economy, we are joined by Neve Ellis of the Jerusalem Post. Thank you as ever for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, Iran's President Hassan Rouhani traveled to Europe this week to encourage foreign investment in the newly opened Iranian economy. Now let's take a look at that.
We want to see good relations with the European Union, including France.
The comprehensive agreement over Iran's nuclear issue reached in Vienna under the joint efforts of various parties was just the first step forward.
We agreed to strengthen cooperation in the energy field, as well as establishing long-term and stable energy relations.
It deals with our requirements, that is, removal of sanctions, and at the same time respecting our right to have our nuclear program for peaceful purposes, because our nuclear program was always for peaceful purposes.
Well, Niamh, we are seeing here a number of very big deals happening, said to be in the double-digit billions. Italy alone has signed $18 billion with Iran. How significant are these business deals?
They're huge deals, and the reason is twofold. First of all, with these sanctions coming down, Iran has access to two different things. One, it has a lot of money coming in, unfrozen assets, access to oil markets that'll help it bring in revenue. And it also has access to all these places where, like Italy, France, that can help it build up its infrastructure. One of the big things plaguing the Iranian economy over these years has been that it has old, aging infrastructure that's been falling apart. So what we're seeing in these big deals is, people coming in and saying, okay, companies coming in and saying, great, $18 billion worth of renewal for train tracks, for travel, for transport, for steel factories, for oil refineries, for all of these things that have been aging and falling apart in Iran for years. Now, of course, for the everyday Iranian, that's not going to have an immediate effect, but these are the kinds of investments that Iran needs to really get its economy up and going. So even though it's not going to be instant gratification, once these things happen, you're going to see the effects in the Iranian economy in the future.
Interesting. And this is the first official visit from Iran to Europe in decades. Which countries were the most favorable to Iran?
I certainly think that you saw a great showing in Italy, and the sign that, those Euro signs that they're seeing there are huge. But of course in France, especially with the car manufacturers, you have Renault going back in there, Citroën. Those deals aren't finalized, but, they're probably expected to be signed today or announced in the coming days for all of those cars to go back into Iran.
We are seeing, though, a stark contrast in the U.S. with sanctions still in place over there. Are we going to see Europe here benefiting the most from Iran opening up to the world?
There's no question about it that, these European companies, and let's remember that this was the status quo ante, before these major unified sanctions came on under the Obama administration. Iran still had very strong ties with European countries, even though it did not with the U.S. But what's interesting is that these U.S. sanctions are still making it difficult for some European companies, because companies that are dealing with both the U.S. and Iran have to really silo that money. They have to make sure that Iranian money doesn't get into the U.S. financial institutions or U.S. Subsidiaries. So a lot of the people are thinking twice about whether and how to invest in Iran if that is in fact what they want to do.
Interesting point. And speaking about investments and what to do with money, a lot of Iranians are said to have been saving their money to wait for essentially these goods to come in. What are they looking to buy?
Absolutely. Well, the number one thing that they're really looking for is cars, because cars are the kinds of thing that we mentioned the French car manufacturers that they haven't been able to get. And there have been surveys taken of the Iranian public, and they say that the things that they really want to buy are cars, foreign cars, once they're able to do it. The other things that are going to be available to them are actually, it's not a specific thing that, it couldn't get this or that. It's that there was not enough competition, of course, in their economy. So now that these import bans are lifted, they're going to be able to get lower prices for the everyday things. They also say that one of the big benefits of these sanctions being lifted are, they think that it's going to be for advancing their careers, for traveling, although, of course, visa restrictions that the U.S. are putting up is making it more difficult for them in some places.
Right, and you mentioned traveling here. I did see that there were deals to buy Boeing airliners. So how does this impact travel for Iran?
Yeah, of course. Their airline fleet has been aging for years, and it's always been one of the prime points of contention. But they're really looking at Airbus and getting the European air transport fleet back up and running to help them out, yeah.
And what about the U.S. side?
On the U.S., of course, since they have all of those other sanctions in place, they are not able to take advantage of some of these things. But, on some items like caviar or pistachios, these things that have sort of a global commodity market, then they are. And also the U.S. has been strategic in lifting certain sanctions because they think that, for example, telecommunications products, tablets, computers, things like that. Those are things that the U.S. government wants in Iran. They want people to be able to communicate and sort of get out of the state-sponsored censorship. So they've been open about letting those things in. And indeed, we mentioned cars earlier, but that's right. Number 2 on the list after cars were computers and tablets.
And just last word here, can we expect any tariffs to go onto these commodities and imports coming in?
It's totally possible that Iran will do that to try to get more revenue, especially given that the price of oil is so low. But I hope, if they want to do it, then it's probably a mistake for their economy.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Niv Ellis of the Jerusalem Post. That wraps up our show today. Do stay tuned here every day for all your global economic coverage. I'm Natalie Ehrlich from the Jaffa Port. Thank you so much for watching.